Climbing My Grandfather is one of a small number of poems that the poet Andrew Waterhouse wrote before his suicide in 2001 at the age of 42. In it, the poet, using an extended metaphor, pictures his grandfather as a mountain that is to be climbed and explored. He begins his journey at the base of the mountain, at his grandfather's shoes, and continues the ascent up his body until he reaches the summit, his grandfather's head. The image of an impressive natural feature such as a mountain evokes the idea of his grandfather as a permanent and never-changing landmark in the poet's emotional landscape. The difference in scale between the speaker and his grandfather alludes to the way in which adults are often perceived by small children as solid, towering and monumental presences. It makes us perhaps think of a small child looking up at their grandparent and scrambling to get onto their lap. The physical description, in all its minute details, whilst warm and affectionate, is not at all romanticised. Children have a habit of being brutally honest about what they observe, and Waterhouse captures this in his description of his grandfather's loose skin, wrinkles, scars, splintered nails and dirty hands. This very real description, however, captures the love that this man feels for his grandfather far more authentically than any idealised portrait ever could. The poem is written in free verse. It has one stanza of 27 lines. There is neither rhyme scheme nor formal base metre, although the poet does employ assonance and consonance. For example, there is extensive sibilance throughout, which gives the poem a warm and gentle tone. It is also given cohesion through the way in which the poet systematically works his way from his grandfather's feet to the top of his head. There is extensive enjambment and caesura that give the poem momentum and continuity from one stage of his journey to the next. Furthermore, frequent use of fronted adverbials adds to its sense of rhythm. The poem has a conversational tone as the poet employs everyday language mixed with words that form a semantic field of mountaineering. Much of the imagery either describes textures or alludes to the sense of touch, which adds to its feeling of physicality and intimacy. The poem is written in the first person, I, and the present tense, which makes it intensely personal and gives it a sense of immediacy, as though we are experiencing the memory at the same time as the speaker. The speaker begins by stating, "I decide to do it free, without a rope or net." Free climbing without any safety equipment is perilous and could involve a fall. Metaphorically, he is rejecting any supports, perhaps including photographs, to jog his memory. There is also a sense that he is allowing himself to remember his grandfather freely, without any defence mechanisms in place to protect his emotions. He is therefore running the risk of opening up old wounds to experience grief that has been buried for a long time. The poet starts his metaphorical ascent on his grandfather's old brogues, dusty and cracked. Brogues are rather old-fashioned leather shoes that have decorative perforations. The adjectives dusty and cracked indicate that the shoes are old, like their wearer. This very first image is a signal that this is not going to be an idealised depiction of his grandfather, but a very real, warts and all, portrait which is comforting in its familiarity. For the poet, the shoes are perhaps like boulders at the bottom of a mountain, the climbing of which allows him an easy scramble onto his trousers. These are a bit trickier though, as he pushes into the weave, trying to get a grip. The texture of the cloth becomes the texture of the mountain face. The spaces between the threads in the fabric become the cracks and fissures in the rock, and evokes the idea that the memories are becoming more difficult for him to access after his relatively easy start. The image, by the overhanging shirt I change direction, suggests that his grandfather might have a protruding stomach or an untucked shirt. Either way, the poet has come up against an obstacle and has to take a more circuitous route by traversing along his belt, which means mainly going sideways rather than up. This is an indication that this mental journey is not necessarily going to be a straightforward one. The speaker comes to an earth-stained hand, the nails of which are splintered and give good purchase. These details suggest that he remembers his grandfather as an outdoors man who spent his time gardening. The fact that the nails are splintered suggests that he does manual labour and is not vain about his appearance. They also, metaphorically, allow the poet to get a good grip on the memory, suggesting that they are a very evocative image and a minute detail that he noticed about him. The speaker continues his journey up his grandfather's hand, where the skin of his fingers is smooth and thick like warm ice. The simile, like warm ice, contains an oxymoron, evoking the smoothness of the ice on the side of a mountain, but with the warmth of flesh. On his arm I discover the glassy ridge of a scar. The phrase glassy ridge is suggestive of the pale shininess of the raised scar tissue that stands out against his otherwise hairy and textured skin. The inclusion of this detail evokes a three-dimensional man who has a history. The speaker shows tenderness towards his grandfather, evident in the adverb gently, as he places his feet gently in the old stitches and moves on. He appears to not want to linger here. Perhaps it is because he respects the old man's privacy, or does not want to cause him pain. The poet does stop, though, at his still firm shoulder, as he rests for a while in the shade. This image of solidity and respite from the sun suggests that the grandfather provides safety and security for his grandson. The poet alludes to the dangers inherent in remembering those who have died by equating them to looking down from a height, which he resolves not to do, for climbing has its dangers. Metaphorically, climbing his grandfather, or picturing him in such minute detail that he takes on an almost physical form, runs the risk of opening up old wounds and reliving grief as though it is still fresh. After his pause, he then pulls himself up the loose skin of his neck to a smiling mouth to drink among teeth. This image alludes to a rocky mountain spring, which is cool and refreshing, suggesting that the memory of his grandfather's smile gives him emotional reinvigoration and the energy to continue the climb, as refreshed he crosses the screed cheek. The reference to screed may be the creation of a past participle from the poet turning the noun scree, which is an accumulation of broken rock fragments at the base of mountain cliffs, into a verb. The image suggests erosion and weathering, in much the same way as a face becomes wrinkled and weathered as one ages. The assonant long E sounds slow the pace down and suggest the care with which he has to make this manoeuvre as he continues his ascent towards the eyes, where he watches a pupil slowly open and close. The pupil in an eye dilates and narrows when it changes focus. For a moment there is a sense of connection and interaction between the two, as the grandfather seems for the first time to become aware of what his grandson is doing, as his eyes focus on the small figure which has just come into view. It is a moment of imagined shared intimacy between the grandfather and his grandson. The final 8 lines of the poem make up one complete sentence as the speaker reaches the summit. Then up over the forehead, the wrinkles well spaced and easy, to his thick hair, soft and white at this altitude, reaching for the summit, where gasping for breath I can only lie watching clouds and birds circle, feeling his heat, knowing the slow pulse of his good heart. The multiple clauses and phrases of this long sentence add to the sense of breathlessness to which the poet alludes on line 24. The grandfather's thick hair, which is soft and white at this altitude, evokes the clouds that often gather round the summits of mountains. There is a sense of achievement and relief as he flops to the ground, gasping for breath. I can only lie watching clouds and birds circle. The way in which the poet gasps for breath could also allude to the emotional toll that this memory has had on him. The poem ends on a calm image, though, as he feels his grandfather's heat, knowing the slow pulse of his good heart. These last two lines have a preponderance of assonant long vowel sounds, such as feeling his heat and knowing the slow, which slow the pace down and evoke what he feels was his grandfather's calm and steadying influence. The consonance of heat and heart draws attention to these two words and helps to portray the man as one who was full of life, passion, and kindness. There is a sense that the speaker feels he has achieved his goal at the end of the poem. Through a painstaking reconstruction of the physical presence of his grandfather, he has reconnected, unscathed, with the love and affection that they shared. Thanks for watching. I'd really appreciate any questions or comments below. I look forward to hearing from you.